Okay, thank you, Hugh, for that introduction. Thank you also for the invitation to be here. It's a real privilege to be here and to be part of this lecture series along with the other speakers who you've been hearing from over the past year. So it's a real privilege. My title's changed a little bit from the one that you read out. It's more or less the same set of arguments that I want to make. I want to reflect on this idea of global urbanism. And I want to do so through the notion of fragments. So I'm thinking a little bit about what the idea of fragments might bring to understanding this thing called global urbanism. So that's what I want to do. And I want to do so through a set of examples from cities that are quite different in nature that I've been working on over the past year or so. So I'm going to talk about examples from Mumbai in India, from Kampala in Uganda, and from Cape Town in South Africa. So we'll see how it goes. So global urbanism, what is global urbanism? I think global urbanism now is perhaps the fundamental epistemological debate in urban studies, in the sense that whilst there's a lot of different conversations going on in urban studies, the question of what this thing is, global urbanism, is right at the heart of that agenda. In fact, has become in some ways, to ask what is global urbanism is also to ask what is urbanism itself, in terms of how the debate is currently constituted in urban studies. And there's a variety of interventions I don't want to go into detail on, but just to mention, because I think many of you will know about these different debates, but planetary urbanization, for example, some of Neil Brenner and Christiane Smith's very provocative, interesting work, work on urban worlding or worlding cities, people like Ananya Roy and Iwa Ong, work on global and world cities, Peter Taylor and so on, Saskia Sassen, ordinary cities, comparative cities, so I'm thinking of Jennifer Robinson and so on. Many people here will be familiar with those debates, all of which are taking very different perspectives on this question of global urbanism, what it is, how we research it, why it matters. So why does it matter? It matters because, not so much because we know that the majority of humans now reside in cities, more than 50% of the human population lives in cities. That's not necessarily why global urbanism matters, although that is, of course, a significant change. It matters because urbanism itself, cities and urbanism, are reshaping political, economic, cultural, and environmental processes to an extent that they never have done in the past. We talk now routinely, for example, about an Anthropocene, a new era ushered in of geological as well as environmental change caused by cities, in which cities are not just the problem, but also the solution. And the same goes for example, the economy. Cities drive the economy, they're the problem, but they're also the solution. And we hear this time and time again across research, policy, practice, and so on. So global urbanism, whatever it is, matters. The question of what it is matters. And there's different interventions that try to take different slices into this question. So just one example, recent example, is Andy Merrifield's book, The New Urban Question, which obviously recalls Manuel Castell's book, The Urban Question, published in 1977, I think. And Merrifield in this book argues that there is a global logic to urbanism. And that logic is what he calls neo-Haussmannization. So he's taking the kind of Haussmann story from Paris and he's portraying it sort of writ large across the globe. And what neo-Haussmannization effectively means for Merrifield in this very provocative, interesting book is a kind of predatory speculative capitalism. So a kind of top 1% elite group that are acting as predators on the urban landscape, speculating with housing, real estate markets, infrastructures, and so on, in a world which more and more of us are increasingly shut out from. And this predatory speculative capitalism is what drives the global urban project for Merrifield. It's reproduced across different cities. And what's really important about Merrifield's argument is he argues that whilst the way in which this logic plays out varies from city to city, its essential qualities and substance remains the same across global space. A global ruling class intent on its business, as he puts it. So that's one, I think, recent, quite important intervention into this question of what is global urbanism. Another example, a bit earlier than Merrifield, but certainly someone who Merrifield engages with a great deal, Henri Lefebvre's work, The Urban Revolution, an extremely important book for a number of the debates I've already mentioned, planetary urbanization, for instance, I mentioned as well. And I think Lefebvre, in some ways, symbolizes this kind of thinking that Merrifield shows in his book around global urbanism. Because what you find in Lefebvre is a vision of urbanism gone global, but a vision of urbanism gone global which is characterized by fragmentation. So there is a totality, as Lefebvre puts it in this quote from The Urban Revolution, but it's a totality that cannot be grasped, that always escapes us, that is always elsewhere. And one of the reasons that totality cannot be grasped is because it is characterized by fragmentation. So fragmentation in the economy, fragmentation in urban form, the built environments, the inequalities we see around us in cities. Capitalist urbanization requires fragmentation to function. So that's why the totality is always there, but always escaping, always exceeding us. Which I think this notion of global urbanism as fragmentation is right at the heart of a lot of the critical urban project. So we can think about, just to shorthand a few sort of related concepts, splintering urbanism, Steve Graham and Simon Marvin's path-breaking book on urban infrastructure, debates on gated enclaves, gentrification. Loretta Lee's was mentioned in relation, and her arguments are very interesting arguments on planetary gentrification are important here. Also Tom Slater's work in that area. Mollification, post-justice urbanism, so on. There's, we can go on and think about the different socio-spatial concepts that critical urbanists use to describe fragmentation as the kind of key characteristic of global urbanism, of urbanism itself. And more often than not, these forms of fragmentation are driven by neoliberalization. Neoliberalization in relation to other concepts, other processes, sorry. So things like cultural exclusions and so on that are kind of like reshape neoliberalism as it travels through different spaces. And there's a long history of these types of debates. Now, I always like this image here, which is quite an old image now, it's over 20 years old, by Cornelia Parker, the sculptor, which is from a book actually on fragments, which is more in the realm of sort of cultural studies. And what she did was, Cornelia Parker, was she took her garden shed and she blew it up. And this is the garden shed in mid-explosion. She found the fragments and put them back together in this way and froze it and displayed it in this way. And I think in some ways this, for me, symbolizes or provides a nice insight into the way in which fragmentation has become the kind of key characteristic through which global urbanism is understood in critical urban studies. As Lefebvre says, you have a totality, it's there, we know it's there, but it's fragmented. It's always in a process of being pulled apart and torn apart. And in fact, that fragmentation is what makes it work. That's what allows capitalist urbanization to work in Lefebvre's reading. But one of the interesting questions then becomes, well, what is the role of the fragments? What is the role of these sort of bits and pieces? How do we understand the role of fragments in global urbanism? Or as Jamie Peck has put it in a slightly different context, what is the role of particularizing moments, these shards, these bits and pieces, in the purposeful reconstruction of urban theories, which I think that question that Jamie Peck put in this particular paper is probably one of the key questions for urban studies at the moment. So what I want to do is, I want to think about those fragments as clues or entry points to a different kind of archive of global urbanism, a different kind of collection of ways of thinking about this thing called global urbanism. And I'm inspired here by, in particular, post-colonial debates, post-colonial urban debates in particular. And so just to name two voices which I think are very important here, Edgar Pieterse from Cape Town, University of Cape Town, who recently argued in relation to African urbanism, I have no doubt that the street, the slum, the waste dump, the taxi rank, the mosque and the church will become the catalysts of an unanticipated African urbanism. And I think what Edgar is arguing here, if I'm right, is not just that these ordinary spaces will be catalysts for new ways of thinking and researching in African cities, but will also prompt new ways of politicising and changing African cities. Or Vinay Gidwani's point from his research on Delhi, on waste pickers, on garbage grounds, where he talks about telling the stories of the people who work on garbage grounds, who do the recycling, those people who are remaindered, stigmatised, cast aside in different kinds of ways. And he argues that telling those stories of the people who work on those waste grounds is the primary intellectual and political task of the post-colonial scholar as archivist of the city. And so I think in quite sort of important ways, this opens up a way of thinking about global urbanism through ordinary, often rather overseen, neglected kinds of spaces. And so my kind of basis for thinking about this other archive or other archives of global urbanism comes from my research on informal settlements, or slums as they're often called. And clearly any project of global urbanism has to, at some level, engage with informal settlements. If it's true that 1 in 3 people who live in cities now live in an informal settlement, then it surely can't be right that much global urban theory doesn't correspond to that, isn't driven by some kind of relation to that in a fundamental way. So informal settlements are what I'm calling here popular neighbourhoods, following Thomas Blom-Hansen and Oscar Verkijk's work, are central surely to any kind of coupling of urban and global, as Mike Davis so forcefully reminded us in his book Planet of Slums, forcing those two terms together, planet and slums. And whatever disagreements people might have had over Mike Davis's book, that book was absolutely pivotal in positioning the slum, or the popular neighbourhood, at the heart of the urban debate in research, policy and practice, and also in politics. And these, of course, are neighbourhoods, these popular neighbourhoods, which are urbanising faster than cities more generally, and which are often deeply fragmented spaces. You know, so when I'm thinking about fragments here, I'm thinking about urban forms, physically fragmented urban spaces, spaces which are always already fragmented, have never been anything other than fragmented. Spaces where the state is often unwilling or unable to provide basic infrastructure, basic housing, services and livelihood, where residents are forced to work between a city they inherit, which they inherit as a set of fragments, and a city they try to produce, which is really about oftentimes addressing those fragments and the failure of those fragments to provide. So how might these kinds of fragments figure in understandings of global urbanism? That's a question which is buzzing around my head a little bit at the moment. So I'm going to take you through very quickly 3 sets of examples in relation to these fragments. And I'm thinking here of a global urbanism of fragmentation and fragments. A global urbanism which is produced through fragmentation, but which is made up also of fragments. So to think of not just the fragmentation, as quite a lot of critical urban theory does, but to also take seriously the fragments themselves. 3 examples. Working with fragments is to sustain urban life, that's Mumbai. Assembling and exhibiting fragments, that's Kampala. And then finally, and I think very importantly, the question of rejecting fragments, the question of when fragments are not enough, and thinking about wholes, thinking about the relationship between the fragment and the whole. And I think that brings us back in a way to what Lefebvre was doing. It brings us back in a way to Cornelia Parker's Exploding Garden Shed. Because what Parker is trying to communicate is the relationship between the fragment and the whole in that image. And I think that that's very important for the story of global urbanism. And we'll come back to that in relation to Cape Town towards the end of the presentation. And all of this is going to be talking about popular neighbourhoods, informal settlements. So firstly, I mean, this is work that I've been doing for a few years now, in Mumbai, in various informal settlements. And I want to say right from the start that this is work that would not have been possible without the fantastic insight of Renu Desai, who is in Ahmedabad, and Steve Graham, who is in Newcastle. We worked together on this project. And what we were interested in here was a particular set of fragments, sanitation, in informal settlements. And the way in which people had to work their own material configurations of sanitation in order to get by on a day-to-day basis. So that's what we mean by everyday sanitation, very briefly. So how people work with fragments. And this was very kind of social material processes, very mundane everyday processes. And a lot of the research was in this neighbourhood here, Rafinagar, in northeast Mumbai, which is a neighbourhood produced through fragmentation. It's one of the poorest neighbourhoods in the city, has the lowest human development index in the city, the highest rate of child mortality. It's one of the, it's a largely Muslim neighbourhood, which means it's excluded and on the fringes of the city, both because of where it is and what it is economically, but also because it's a Muslim neighbourhood. Because Mumbai is a city run by the Shiv Sena, which is a Hindu chauvinist party, anti-Muslim politics. So it's kind of doubly discriminated against. It's an illegal neighbourhood, according to the state. It's not notified, and it's a Muslim neighbourhood. So it suffers multiple layers of discrimination. There's regular demolition, and there's very few sanitation provisions here. There's a few public toilets, effectively. So people work with fragments all the time in order to cope in this neighbourhood. They build informally all the time. Housing, water, sanitation, power, constantly constructing different things individually and in collectives. And one example of that is indeed toilets. So these are hanging latrines, which are built usually by groups of residents working together. And they're usually built just before the monsoon, because when the monsoon happens, the neighbourhood floods, and people have to wade across the neighbourhood to get to the public toilets, the community toilets. So they build these temporary provisions to get them through the monsoon. And sometimes they hang around a bit longer and they stay, and these toilets don't collapse, and people improve them and they spend more money on them, and they get stronger materials, and so on and so forth. So people working with material fragments to provide a basic consistency to a fundamental aspect of their lives, which the state will not provide. Other examples, such as building improvisations to drainage systems. They're very mundane things that residents do every day to cope with actively working on the material fragments of a city, becoming infrastructure in a way, as Abdulmalik Simone has so powerfully argued. I don't want to go into detail. I just want to flag up 5 key points about these fragments that we were interested in this research. The first thing was that these fragments were essential to sustaining life in the face of fragmentation. So when you're living in a neighbourhood which is always already fragmented, these kind of working with the fragments materially is obviously vital, just to making sure that you have basic provisions. These fragments are neither micro nor macro. They're not individualised. They're not things that people necessarily do on their own, but neither are they kind of large-scale infrastructural provisions. This is not the building of a large infrastructure project. This is more of a kind of collective intervention by a group of residents in a lane or in a part of a neighbourhood. So it's a kind of connective tissue between the macro and the micro. The other thing about these fragments, the third thing, is they don't add up to a totality. They don't scale up to a kind of organized system. They remain kind of at the level of fragments, which address gaps, but then collapse, get rebuilt, get reworked over time. As Deleuze and Parnet put it, additions which never reach a total. Fourthly, they change form over time and space and for different people. And fifthly, they're shaped, this kind of relates to that, by social vectors of class, gender, caste, religion, and ethnicity, which militate who gets access to these fragments and who doesn't. I don't have much time to go into that, but just to flag up those 5 elements as important to how I'm thinking about these fragments initially. Okay, secondly, assembling and exhibiting fragments. And this is when I want to turn to Kampala I want to flag up a set of other fragments which are important to the constitution and the sustenance of everyday life in an informal settlement in Kampala. And the neighbourhood I want to talk about is this neighbourhood here, which is not a very clear picture, a neighbourhood called Namawongo in central Kampala. And this too is a largely illegal neighbourhood. Parts of it are legal, but most of it isn't. And again, a neighbourhood which has suffered from structural fragmentation, legally, in terms of the regulations around services, in terms of the provision of housing and infrastructure. In fact, it suffers from regular demolition by the state because it's not on land which is legal and because developers want to use this space for other purposes. And this is also collaborative work. This is work with Jonathan Silver, a great friend and colleague at Durham, and it's ongoing work that we're doing there, just like the Mumbai research is also ongoing. And what we became interested in was the way in which life is sustained in this neighbourhood and how people move around this neighbourhood and the city as they attempt to sustain life, fragment by fragment. And I want to flag up 4 fragments here which are important: care, consolidation, coordination, and speculation. So we worked with these 6 residents in Namawongo. The top left there, that's Masengeri. He is a local party chief. Next to him, across from him, is Josephine. She sells fruits in central Kampala. Below Josephine is Amiri. Amiri is he's a carpenter who works in a woodshed in Namawongo. Across from him is Jennifer, who is a widow in Namawongo and who sells beads, little pieces of jewellery made of beads. And then below her is Ali, who's a fruit and veg salesman, and across from Ali is Ishmael, who is a taxi driver, and who very sadly passed away actually during the research project. So very quickly, 4 fragments which sustain everyday life. Caring. Jennifer, we're calling this caring not because it's not simply because it's altruistic, because care is also reciprocal. When you care for people, you also get things out of that, sometimes economically, socially, or in other kinds of ways. But caring is important to the making of these fragments, these social material fragments in Namawongo. Jennifer, for example, is a kind of node in a network. She's doing a lot of the work that you'd expect public services to do in other contexts. For example, she helps other mothers, widows in particular, and many women in this neighbourhood are widows because of the number of men who have died due to HIV/AIDS. And she, for example, will help mothers get their children into school, and she'll help them get their school fees paid for. She'll also help get access to things like sanitation or water or drainage facilities. She also trains people in livelihoods, for example, in making beads, which women will then sell in the neighbourhood or in town. So she's become a very important social infrastructure, if you like, and in that sense constitutes this fragment of care. Amiri is a different example. This is consolidation. Amiri is consolidating his livelihood by being trained by his uncle as a carpenter. His uncle owns a woodshed in Namawongo. And actually, Amiri in that photograph is standing outside the Hilton, the biggest hotel in Kampala, where he was helping to build the gym, which is a long way for him to have come. He started off life as a scavenger on a garbage ground, basically recycling plastics, and his uncle has trained them up. So he's able to consolidate his livelihoods. So this too is an important fragment in the neighbourhood, being able to consolidate, but it's differentiated. So Josephine, for example, you can see below, she's selling mangoes. She's living day to day, and sometimes she makes enough money to feed the kids, sometimes she doesn't. She's often chased out of town by the municipality, who's trying to clamp down on selling fruit in the city. So this consolidation itself is very differentiated socially by class and by gender, for instance, and by who you know, by who your contacts and networks are. Coordination is another important fragment for making everyday life possible. This is Masengeri. He's a local political party chief. And any kind of infrastructure development that happens in Namawongo, the building of a toilet, a water connection, even a house extension, it all has to be approved by him. And his magic stamp, that's the bottom figure, but the bottom image, if he doesn't stamp something, then it doesn't get approved, it never happens. So he's become an enormously important power broker who's done quite well financially and in other ways through this system. But this too is an important fragment for the making of everyday life. And finally, speculation. This is Ali's fruit and veg store. And it's through building relationships of trust, it's through negotiating, allowing prices when he buys fruit and veg for his store, that Ali was able to buy a new place for his fruit and veg store right at the entrance of the market in Namawongo. And in moving his fruit and veg store to the front of that market, he was able to get a lot more business from that. So there's a constant kind of speculation here, and each of the residents that we spoke to, each of those 6 residents, were involved in speculation at some level. So what we've been arguing, John and I, is that these 4 fragments, coordination, consolidation, speculation, and care, are important for the making and the sustaining of everyday life in this popular neighbourhood. And just like in Rafinagar, these fragments, although they're very different in form from those in Rafinagar, allow everyday life to take place as kind of mid-level concepts between the individual and the neighbourhood, at a sort of collective level. They involve relations between people and between people and things. So they're collective, they're social material, and they're carved out in often precarious conditions formed through fragmentation. So we did this research with these 6 residents in Kampala, and we were left with a question which was, okay, so we now have these different fragments through which life is made and sustained. But what do we do with these fragments? And what can we do with these fragments that give something back to the people who have given us their time, these 6 residents in particular, who we spent a lot of time with? So we tried to think about, is there a way of making these fragments speak to different publics? And the conclusion we came to was that given that Namawongo is such a stigmatized neighbourhood in Kampala, given that people, a lot of the middle classes in particular in Kampala, see it as a problem space, a place full of crime and drugs and violence, wouldn't it be nice just to present these fragments as such, right? As fragments of everyday life, of a normal, ordinary neighbourhood, which is part of the city, as a kind of political move. Wouldn't that help generate some kind of conversation? So the residents were very excited about this, so we ended up putting together an exhibition of these fragments, which went to the National Museum, the Uganda Museum, and attracted a lot of viewers and some interest. And exhibitions, of course, there's a lot of literature on this, on the exhibition. One of the people who've written about exhibitions, Bruno Latour, reminds us that exhibitions cannot do much, and I think that's true. But what they can do, and this is what we tried to do, was use exhibitions to stage new possibilities. And this point that Latour makes, that exhibitions can explore possibilities with a greater degree of freedom is, I think, important. It allows people to see fragments in different kinds of ways, partly because visitors to the exhibition can compare different kinds of representation of those fragments. So, for instance, the exhibition included photographs of the 6 residents going about their lives, going to work, moving through the city, meeting their friends, playing with their children, meeting up in groups for various different social or cultural occasions. It also included things like the maps that residents made of their daily journeys in and around the city. These are the maps that they made as they moved around. It included a map that compared those routes and why they took different routes through the city. Why Josephine, for example, who was selling fruit, was going to some places and not others in order to avoid being chased by the municipality, who's trying to clamp down on street traders. And so we called this exhibition Celebrating Namawongo, and it was really about putting in a public domain these different fragments of life itself, the ways in which urban life was being sustained. These are residents from Namawongo at the exhibition. It was all designed by residents from Namawongo. Even the painting was done by residents from Namawongo, the painters, who charged us an exorbitant amount for what they did, but there was local people who did it. And we portrayed these stories, these fragments, as kind of assemblages, right? Assemblages of people's lives, assemblages of different moments in their lives, moving through different places. Some representations that we had picked and some that they had picked. So we took these fragments and made them into these assemblages. Of course, we had to make a whole series of cuts. We had to make a whole series of decisions about what we were presenting and what we weren't presenting about these fragments. And the residents were involved in many of those stories, but nonetheless, decisions got made that some of the residents were then unhappy with and later told us about. So, for example, we had an evaluation with the residents after the exhibition, and we said, so what did you like, what didn't you like? And some of the things that came up, residents said there's not enough routes through the city, there's not enough about their own routes through the city. It was too focused on the individuals over the networks, and that was quite interesting to us, because in a way what they were saying was they wanted to hear more about the fragments, things like consolidation and care, and less about themselves, less about their own sort of stories. There wasn't enough on unemployment, homelessness, children and drainage. Jennifer said, I would have a totally different set of pictures. The old house where she used to live in Namawongo before it was demolished, the kiosk where she used to sell food, all the pictures at home that were taken, but not many of which ended up in the exhibition. That was pictures we took of her and her grandchildren in particular. So she was quite opinionated about what we should and shouldn't do, and she was involved in the whole process, but inevitably, this is important because it makes us think about how we represent these fragments. And I think this is one of the important issues I want to push about this question of thinking through fragments as a kind of archive of global urbanism. It's not just finding, identifying and talking about fragments, it's also representing fragments, which is at stake here. And the way in which we represent the fragments requires constant self-reflection. So I'll come back to that. So what I've done so far is I've tried to think about how people work with fragments in different kinds of ways. And fragments here so far are twofold. They are processes that enable urban life to sustain, whether it's in Rafinagar or in Kampala's Namawongo, or they're representations of urban life, the representations that we as researchers are bringing to different publics. And so this starts to open up a way of thinking about global urbanism as a project of firstly understanding neglected urban fragments in popular neighbourhoods, for instance, that enter into the making and unmaking of urban life. And secondly, as a project of representing fragments in different assemblages, research publics of different sorts, and reflecting on those representations as we go, especially with the people who we work with, the residents, for example, who give us their time. Okay, so in the last small section of the presentation, what I want to do then is think beyond fragments. beyond these fragments, these social material urban forms that I've been talking about, through which people sustain everyday life. Because what's obviously clear is that fragments are not themselves sufficient for addressing fragmentation. If global urbanism is partly produced through fragmentation, fragments themselves are clearly insufficient in terms of addressing them. They're often coping mechanisms, and they're often a little bit more than coping mechanisms, but they're not themselves enough to address it. So this calls attention to the relationship between the fragment and the whole, which itself has a very long history in urban studies. So we can think, for example, about Henri Lefebvre's writings on capitalist urbanization, which I've mentioned, and fragmentation. We can think about Walter Benjamin's writings in, for example, the Arcades project, which is an experimentation with the fragment form in montage as a way of finding insights into the whole, in his case, modernity. We can think about post-colonial urban studies of fragments, of difference, people like Dipesh Chakrabarty, for instance. But I think there's also examples and things that we can learn from activists themselves about this relationship between fragments and wholes. And that's what I want to turn to in closing. And this is the third global urbanism of fragments, or opening up of global urbanism and fragments. And it's from fragments to wholes. And it relates to a story of rejecting fragments and addressing fragmentation through the whole. And this is Cape Town. So we're back on sanitation here. And this again is research that Jonathan Silver and I have done. And this is, so 2009 in Cape Town, there's a new politicization of sanitation in popular neighbourhoods, townships and informal settlements in Cape Town. And it comes because the municipality builds, that top image, which may looks like some kind of sort of art installation, that is an actual municipal toilet that was built by the municipality in Cape Town. Basically, they had some money at the end of the year, and they said, right, we're going to build some sanitation in Cape Town's informal settlements and townships. We've got two choices. One is we can have X number of toilets and they will have walls, or we can have Y numbers of toilets, i.e. more toilets, but no walls, because they can't include. And so what this effectively was saying was, you people who live in informal settlements, popular neighbourhoods, you work with fragments. This is what you do. You're good at working with fragments. So we're going to give you a fragment and you can fill in the gap. And people obviously were furious about this. And the reason they were so upset about it was because it was a very powerful kind of reminder that apartheid is not over. Because what it was saying was, a large part of the apartheid project was about an assault on dignity. Well, here's another assault on your dignity. You can have a toilet but no privacy. You don't need that. You can do it yourself. So an open air toilet became a kind of symbol of this sort of failure of infrastructure post-apartheid. So that kicked off activism around sanitation. And then in 2011, it got even more intense. Incidentally, the court between 2009 and 2011, the court had said to the municipality that this was illegal and they weren't to do this anymore. So there is a kind of a sort of a victory there. But in 2011, the whole thing kicked off again. Toilet cleaners, Sanicare is a private company paid by the municipality to maintain toilets in informal settlements and townships. So what they do is they go once a week to toilets in Cape Town and they clean out these old bucket system toilets, because you've got these old standalone toilets which have buckets, and basically the bucket fills up, and so they come and they take that bucket away and they put a clean bucket in, and then that happens once a week. But this company went on strike because the municipality said they were going to half their salaries. There was a massive reduction in their salaries. And as they went on strike, the weeks went past and these buckets were not being collected. People were doing a lot of this work themselves, but there's only so much you can do to maintain that level of human waste, as you can imagine. And so there was people concerned about public health outbreaks, so getting more and more frustrated. There was protests in the streets. They went to the municipality. They were told that they were going to be seen by the municipality. They never really were seen by the municipality. And things kind of grew and grew, and they got locked into a sort of party politics between the ANC and the Democratic Alliance. For those of you who don't know, the Democratic Alliance governs the Western Cape, but the ANC governs the rest of the country. So anything that goes wrong in Cape Town quickly falls into this fact that the DA, the Democratic Alliance, governs the Western Cape. So get caught up in a lot of the party politics. People were getting more and more frustrated. And so then residents in the popular neighbourhood of Barcelona in Cape Town decided to do something different because nothing seemed to be working. So what they did was, a group of the residents agreed to get some of these buckets that were lying around the neighbourhood and empty them on the N2 motorway, which is one of the main roads between the airport and town, near the neighbourhood of Barcelona, as a kind of public protest to draw attention to this issue. And so these are the buckets being cleaned up, and there was a lot of police violence and police brutality against these residents. And then the residents had a meeting about this and said, well, this is great, this gets attention, people listen, it's all over the media. Finally, we're getting listened to, but the problem is that many of us use that motorway to get to work, to use the bus. So we need to be more targeted. So what they did was they started targeting specific sites, and this is when the Poo protests become a critique of urban development. So this is when it's gone from a question of the fragment, a question of can you maintain your toilet, to a question of the whole city. Is this city equal? Does this city provide for me? Is this city going to address fragmentation? That's the question that they were forcing. So Sitembele, who's a prominent leader in this movement, which became known as Sescona, which means we're here, Sitembele told us that they targeted the international airport because it's one of the things the government is grandstanding about as if they don't have any problems. And it's a very powerful statement to go into an airport. One of the most hyper-sanitized spaces of any city is the airport. And to go in and throw huge quantities of human waste at the floor is a very powerful symbolic statement. It's bringing that to those more elite global symbols of the city. And here smell and aesthetics are crucial. So Sitembele again describing buckets being emptied on the steps of a state legislature. We decided to throw poo on the steps of the legislature so that it would smell like it did in Barcelona. So they're very aware of the kind of sensorial politics here, to quote Vini Gadwani, and the power of this shock of smell and the visual presence of waste in these kind of unexpected places. And this generated a debate. But what was really interesting about this was that it was a debate not just about toilets and about providing sanitation, but about dignity, about rights. So when you shift attention from the fragment, from the question of how do we build the right kind of toilets in popular neighbourhoods, to the question of the unequal development of the city, right? When you make that shift, it starts to become a question of rights. Like, who is the city really for, right? So it's partly a question of why are we investing in these big, luxurious airports when we don't have, basic places to go to the toilet for our children. So it becomes a question of rights and dignity rather than just one of fragments. So the mayor goes, that's how desperate it gets. The mayor even turns up for a short visit, and she wears a mask, seemingly unaware of any kind of irony when she goes to Barcelona. And it leads to a new politicisation of infrastructure, of sanitation infrastructure in the city. And I know that sanitation has always been a political issue in Cape Town, as has infrastructure. I mean, there's a long history, for example, of sabotaging infrastructure in South Africa, which was tied up with opposition to the apartheid regime. But there's certainly a sense in which sanitation has now become a new focal point for the politicisation of infrastructure and dignity and rights. This bottom image is from Kosovo, which is another brilliantly named informal settlement in Cape Town. And the municipality had delivered 500 toilets, bucket toilets, to Kosovo. So this is kind of like a reminder of that open air toilet moment that I started the Cape Town example with. 500 toilets. And the activists almost overnight destroyed all 500 toilets. And the reason that happened, according to one of the activists that we interviewed, was that these toilets were not seen to be adequate in standard. They were seen to be another insult on their dignity, another version of the open air toilet, this old bucket system. Why can't we have what the white neighbourhood has down the street? Why do we have to have these bucket toilets? We want Western style toilets that flush, that have sewer connections. In other words, we don't want fragments any longer, we want the whole. We want the integrated sanitation system. We want to be treated as citizens with rights, not as subjects who live on the edge of the city. And I'm going to be closing now because I'm coming short on time, but there's other forms of activism in Cape Town that also make this shift from fragments to wholes, but do it in very different ways, that don't use these kind of spectacular politics of throwing waste at buildings. One example is the Social Justice Coalition. I mentioned Edgar Peterse earlier on. He's been doing some fantastic work on the Social Justice Coalition, knows infinitely more about it than I do. But one of the things that we found from being there was that they also are trying to pursue a politics of the whole, right, rather than a politics of the fragment. And the way in which they're doing that is through an old-fashioned politics of auditing. They're going round informal settlements and townships, and they're checking the condition of toilets, and they're building reports about what these toilets are like, whether they're well maintained, and creating these kind of almost census-like surveys of toilets, and using these reports to pressure the state into improving its provisions. They're also saying to the state, we've got data which is better than yours. We can show you that your data is wrong. You say that 98% has toilets, we can say that it's 67% in this neighbourhood, for example. And they're using now online supporting systems, like reporting systems. So residents will take a photograph of the broken toilet on their smartphone. That gets uploaded into these maps, these real-time maps. There's also, by the way, examples of this in Bombay. I was in Bombay recently, or Mumbai recently. This is the Right to Pee movement, which is similar to the Social Justice Coalition in that it's surveying toilets. And when you speak to the guys from the Right to Pee movement, they are also saying, it's not about just tinkering with the fragments and the toilets in the neighbourhood, it's about a critique of the city as a whole. It's about rights, it's about the question of provision across the city. And they're also doing this. They also thought about having a pee protest, which unfortunately they never went ahead with the pee protest, because it would have been a nice comparison for me with the pee in Mumbai and the poo in Cape Town, but there you go. These different examples of working with sanitation politics are efforts to use a politics of wholes to address fragmentation and to reject the fragment, to reject having to work with fragments. They combine elements of rights, human rights and rights to the city, and they do it in very different ways. So the Social Justice Coalition and the Right to Pee, they have a very active discourse of rights, whereas the poo politics, says Gona, there isn't really a discourse of rights, there's a performance of rights, a demand of rights through the physical throwing of poo into these elite spaces. But what they do is they shift away from the fragment to the whole, and they do so through the notion of rights. When you start to talk about something like rights, you're talking about the whole. So it reveals, I think, the value, these activists in Cape Town reveal the value of understanding global urbanism by thinking the fragment and the whole together. So, in summary, so what I've tried to do here through these three different examples around informal settlements is several things. I've tried, first of all, to open up the question of urban fragments as a way of building alternative archives of global urbanism. And I've said that these urban fragments have 5 characteristics. They're essential to sustaining life in the face of historical fragmentation in informal settlements. They're neither micro nor macro. They don't add up to a totality. Instead, these are practices which address gaps sometimes temporarily, sometimes managing to improve life, sometimes only making slight differences and then requiring more work further down the line. But attempt to kind of like work with the fragments. And they're always working with the fragments. They're never resolving the problem. So they remain fragments. They change over time and space and for different people. They're shaped by different social vectors of class, gender, caste, religion, ethnicity, and so on. So those are some of the characteristics of these fragments. And these fragments, of course, will vary from city to city across the world. They don't have, it's not like you find the same kinds of fragments recurring, even within the same informal settlement, let alone between informal settlements. There's no simple adding up into some kind of global homogeneous story of how fragments are produced and maintained in informal settlements. It just doesn't work that way. And what global urbanism emerges here as a project of understanding neglected urban fragments, neglected because they've remained rather peripheral to the construction of much mainstream global urban understanding. And secondly, to representing these fragments in research and indeed to other publics, as we did through the exhibition. Thirdly, to critically reflecting on those representations with the people we're working with the residents we're actually researching. And fourthly, to moving between fragments and wholes, a global urbanism that involves attention to both the fragment and the whole at the same time. And I think that's where the Cape Town example really has lots of lessons for us, especially around the question of rights as a basis for addressing fragmentation. Not everybody is, my last slide, not everybody, of course, is convinced by this kind of argument and, of course, raise some important questions and challenges against it. So, for example, Michael Storper and Alan Scott have argued recently in IGER that urban studies needs to guard against what they call over-hasty impulses to take certain dramatic or peculiar instances of urban development, and many of the cases I've highlighted here certainly have those characteristics. The crumbling infrastructure and violence of Kinshasa, the extensive slums of Mumbai, I don't know who's working in those places, the current financial collapse of southern European cities as prima facie evidence that a reformulation of theory is required. And I think that there's a lot of merit in that, and it's important. Of course, I'm not sure anyone would disagree with that. Although I do find the language there interesting, because notice, for example, the word peculiar. It's interesting to see who gets to call what peculiar and who doesn't, and from which position. So I think there's an important kind of tension there about coming back to what I was saying about fragments and why some spaces remain on the periphery of urban theory, because they're peculiar. But the point they make, I think, is very important about not reformulating theory just because spaces look very different. So the key questions, though, must be, I think, instead, not to reformulate theory on the basis of, on the very fact of fragments existing in different places, but instead to ask three things. Firstly, how do fragments resonate across urban space globally? So do we see, between different cities, kind of family resemblances in different ways of building and sustaining urban life, for instance, in informal settlements, as one example. Secondly, how are fragments and wholes thought together in different debates, whether it's theoretical debates or debates that activists have or debates that residents have, whatever it might be, and what possibilities do they open for reimagining urbanism and for addressing fragmentation? And thirdly, can these work towards the construction of archives, other kinds of archives of global urbanism? So that's sort of where I'm thinking is at the moment on this particular paper. Any thoughts, feedback, questions would be much appreciated. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks.